Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, today we're starting a new topic. We're going to be looking now at the Western Hemisphere, at the American continent, particularly the Middle America, what's called Mesoamerica, Mesoamerican civilizations. We're going to be looking at three main civilizations that flourish in this region, the Olmec, Teotihuacan in the Central Valley of Mexico, and the Maya. Again, they're all emerging in a region that is really the middle portion of the continent, and despite the fact that those civilizations will express very unique, very distinct characteristics, they all shared, as we'll see, many common ideas, many common themes in common, to the point that it can be argued that Mesoamerica as a whole, despite the fact that there's a number of different civilizations emerging, they all shared a similar culture, similar cultural ideas, beliefs, and practices that altogether, all of those civilizations constitute a single civilization. Just call it Mesoamerican civilization. All right, so let us go to our lecture outline. Once again, this is the sixth topic of the semester, Mesoamerica, Olmec, Teotihuacan, and Maya. And the way we're going to approach this topic, the table of contents show that we're first going to offer a general introduction to the Amerindian peoples and Mesoamerican civilization. All right, so this is just a general introduction as to what were the origins of the Native Americans, for example, some of their stages of development in the American continent, and we're going to see also the rise of civilizations as well. We're going to be able to identify the major civilizations that flourish in the American continent, although we're just going to explore Mesoamerica, of course. The general introduction is also going to look at the geographical background of Mesoamerica, trying to understand the geography that can help us understand the features and characteristics of the civilizations that will flourish in this part of the world. Remember that geography not necessarily determines the kind of civilization that flourishes, but it has an important and very significant influence on the kind of ideas, the kind of institutions that the civilizations implement. All right, so once we cover the general introduction, we're going to look at part one. In part one, we'll look at the pre-classic era of Mesoamerica. We're going to look at the Olmec. In this case, the Olmecs were the forerunners of civilization in Mesoamerica. We're going to get to see very closely the rise of the Olmec city-states, for example, looking at their societies, their political structures, and religious worldview as well. Part two is going to look at the classic era of Mesoamerica, the so-called Golden Age of Mesoamerican civilizations. And here we see two very unique expressions taking place. One is in the Central Valley of Mexico, what is called Teotihuacan. Again, the city of Teotihuacan was a major city-state that dominated the entire central portion of what today is the Valley of Mexico. And more to the southeast, in the Yucatan Peninsula and parts of Central America, we're going to see another civilization that flourished there, and it was the Maya. Again, the Maya civilization. We're also going to get to see their cities, their layouts, for example, their social organization, political structures, and religious beliefs and practices as well. The last part, part three, is going to look at the post-classic period, because at some point in the year 900 AD, the great civilizations of Mesoamerica are going to collapse. There's going to be an abandonment of the cities. The urban centers will be abandoned in mass, in great numbers, and the societies of Mesoamerica will enter a quite different period. It's called the post-classic period, in which, for the most part, people are now living in small communities, villages. There will be some city-states that will remain in place, although gradually they're going to be abandoned as well. So by the time of 1500 AD, just before the arrival of the Spaniards in this region, most of the city-states had been abandoned with very few exceptions. So we're going to get to see that as well, the post-classic period of Mesoamerica. All right, so let's start with general introduction. We start with the general introduction by looking at the overview of Amerindian peoples and civilizations. In other words, here we're to answer the question, first and foremost, where the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples of the American continent came from, and can we track their origins, and also, once we understand their origins, can we track some of their major stages of historical development prior to the rise of civilizations? So we start with that question, where the Native Americans actually come from. Well, one of the most accepted theories in academia today is the theory that the Native Americans actually migrated into the continent, into the distant past, from the Old World, meaning from Asia and Eurasia as well. That is considered the Old World because, according to the diffusion theory, something that we discussed in the very first topic of the semester out of Africa, humanity originated in the African continent. So that's the oldest continent for humanity. That's the cradle of humanity, Africa. And so, according to scientists and archaeologists, around 200,000 years ago or so, Homo sapiens, modern humans, began to migrate out of Africa and move into different areas of the globe. They're going to be populating places like, for example, Europe, the Middle East, parts of Asia as well, and they're going to be creating their unique societies and cultures as they moved around the world. Something we covered very thoroughly in the first topic of the semester. Now, according to this theory, it was about 40,000 years ago that we're going to see a major crossing or outpourings of people, particularly from northern Asia, into the American continent. Again, it's considered to be, 40,000 BC, the tentative date when this great migration took place. So this is, again, leading to the origins of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. The theory, according to science, indicates that about 40,000 BC, there was an ice age that covered a lot of areas of the world with glaciers and ice. So it forced people to move, and it forced people to migrate into new areas, the warmer climates, for example, particularly areas where the animals were moving as well. The bisons, for example, of northern Asia were now moving across a land bridge. It's called the Bering Strait. It's actually a piece of land that connected what is called today Siberia and Alaska. Again, so those two areas of North Asia and North America were connected by a land bridge called the Bering Strait. And the bisons, for example, were crossing over from Siberia to what is today Alaska, and a lot of hunters and gatherers during that time from northern Asia also followed the bison, and they were following the food supply in this case, and they crossed over into the American continent. So this is considered really the first major migration wave that populated an empty continent. Presumably the American continent was emptied from human populations, and this is the very first time that humans inhabit the American continent. So again, the origins of the Native Americans go back to this Bering Strait crossing 40,000 years ago. Now, this, of course, is a process that lasted for several centuries, if not thousands of years. This is not really a process that took over, in matters of years or overnight, but rather it's a very gradual and very slow process of change. Now, what happened is that initially the first inhabitants of the Americas lingered for a while in the northern part of this landmass. Presumably they stay there because the animals that were hunting were there, and also because the climate appeared to be suitable for them to live there during the Ice Age while it lasted. But at some point the Ice Age receded, and as the Earth began to stabilize and warm up, we're going to see the sea level rise again as a result of the glaciers melting as the Earth is warming up once again. And so as the sea level is rising, this land bridge that connected Siberia and Alaska is going to disappear from sight. It's going to be underwater, in other words. So after the Ice Age, the people that ended up crossing over to America will not have the opportunity now to go back to the old world. So they're going to remain in the American continent, and now they're isolated and cut off, so to speak, from the rest of the world. Okay? So this is, according to academia, the most accepted theory about the origins of Native Americans. And of course, there has been genetic research done on populations to look at similarities and connections, DNA connections, for example. And indeed, it appears that the Native Americans share a lot in common genetically with Asian peoples as well, particularly Northern Asian societies, but also Polynesian, from the Polynesian islands of Southeast Asia as well. So again, there's a strong connection, a strong link between Asia and the Native American world, going back to this great crossing 40,000 BC. Okay, so that's as far as science understands, again, the origins of the Native Americans. All right, so now that the Native Americans find themselves in this continent, well, they're now in a new land, so to speak, that they're going to have to explore, and also they're going to have to adapt to this new environment. So we're going to see also migrations taking place over thousands and thousands of years, in which people were moving now south. They're going to be moving away from what today is Alaska. They're going to be moving into what today is Canada. Eventually, they're going to settle, some of them, in present-day United States. Others will continue their march south into places like, for example, today Mexico, others Central America, South America, and even some into the Caribbean islands as well. So again, they're going to populate the entire continent at some point, but this is going to take a long time to do so. Again, it's a slow process of migration and adaptation to different environments, different soils, different diets, and so on. So again, it's a very gradual process. Okay, so that's first and foremost the origins of the indigenous peoples of America. Now, during this march that I just mentioned, that spanned between, let us just say, 40,000 to 8,000 BC, Native Americans are going through a period of time that scholars call the Archaic period. This is consistent with something we already covered in the first topic of the semester, the Old Stone Age or the Paleolithic age, for example. And I'm not going to go over all of the issues dealing with the Old Stone Age or the Paleolithic age. I'm just here going to concentrate on the kind of social and cultural developments that Native Americans formed during this period of time. Those are unique expressions, in other words, of the Old Stone Age that are taking place in this part of the world. So during the Archaic period, we see two major formations taking place. One is a social formation, and that is kinship. And that is that the Native Americans that are moving from place to place and trying to adapt and survive in different regions and environments, they're coming together and they're forming a society, so to speak, that is going to remain a constant across thousands of years, even all the way to the year 1500 AD and beyond. And that is that the way Native Americans come together and form a society is that they're coming together as a family. Again, those are actually kin groups. So kinship, again, the idea that people belong to an extended family group and they travel together, they help each other survive in the environment, they collaborate with one another. This is going to be the norm of Native American social organization, kinship. During the Archaic period, of course, initially people lived in bands. Those were, small groups of people, 20, 50, maybe 80 members that travel together, hunting and gathering. Once again, people see in the band an extended family. They're related to one another. That is the basis of their social identity. But much later, in a later period of the Archaic period, we're going to see the formation of tribes. Those bands are going to grow in numbers. Eventually, there will be a cluster of people, 500, 1,000, perhaps even 2,000 people, and they're going to also live together under the premise that they are related to one another, that they are indeed a large extended family. So kinship, keep that in mind, is going to remain very, very significant in the way Native Americans organize themselves as communities and as societies. Okay? No matter how small the society was or how large and complex, at the very heart of their society was the idea of kinship. The other formation during the Archaic period was the religious worldview. Native Americans are going to forge a view of the universe to provide meaning, to try to explain why things happen in the world. Why there's rain, for example, why there are volcanic eruptions, why there are catastrophes in the world, what really makes the world works. So, and this is really universal. Not only Native Americans were creating, a religious worldview that was largely based on visions of spirits, but again, all over the world, we see similar developments taking place, whether it's Africa, Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. All over the world, people are really formulating a similar worldview, and that worldview is called animism. Again, it's a worldview in which people try to come to terms with the world around them, trying to explain how it works by believing that the world of nature, everything in the world of nature, whether we're talking about rocks and plants, for example, or animals, humans, natural forces and phenomena, that everything had a spirit. That rocks have a spirit, Plants and trees have a spirit. The land has a spirit. Even mountains, caves have spirits, for example. The clouds, the rain have spirits. Everything has a spirit, and that is the life force that actually makes the world come to life and to move as well. Why the water moves along the creek, for example, or a river? It's because the water spirits are actually moving the water, for example. The clouds move across the sky because those are cloud spirits moving the clouds and so on. So everything has a spirit. It's called animism. Everything is animated by spirit essence, spiritual forces or spiritual essences. So this is going to be the basis, as we'll see, of all Native American religions that flourish much, much later. Of course, Native American religions will become very sophisticated, very complex over time, but at the very core of all Native American religions was the idea that everything had an essence, a spiritual force or spiritual entity living within it. Okay. The other religious idea that is formed during the Archaic period is shamanism. And so shamanism is really the idea that there are individuals that are born with specific or very unique gifts, magical powers of sorts, that allow them to speak to the spirits of nature. They can see the spirits, they can communicate with them, they can travel into the spirit world as well, and they can commune with the spirit world. So once they come back into the world of the living, the world of nature, they can provide guidance, they can provide wisdom, they can provide healing to other human beings. Okay, it's called shamanism. Again, so this is really the equivalent of the very first spiritual leader among the natives. He is the spiritual guide, he is the spiritual healer, the spiritual leader that is connecting with the spirit world. And so he's the very first person that conducts rituals. He performs rituals to the spirits of the land, the spirits of the animals for hunting and so on. He's the one carrying out all of those rituals. As we'll see, this is important because later on the shamans will become central in the political structures of Native American civilizations. As a matter of fact, the shamans will, in time, will become the political rulers of the kingdoms and the city-states that we're going to get to see in this topic. They were all shamans. So the shamans started out as simple healers and spiritual guides, but over time, they're going to occupy a central place within the society. They're going to exercise significant authority, significant power in their own communities, as we'll get to see. Now, at some point, the Archaic period is going to end and a new era begins around 8000 BC, the horticultural period, something that we have discussed, of course, in previous topics. It is important to note that early farming practices, which is really horticulture, started almost simultaneously in different parts of the world at the same time, around 8000 BC. So this is, again, a very striking coincidence that similar ideas, similar practices are emerging simultaneously, even in areas that are considered totally cut off and isolated from the rest of the world, like the American continent. So one of the explanations why this is happening has to do with climate change. Around 8000 BC, there was a kind of mini ice age. It was not as severe as the ice age that we discussed, 40,000 BC. But it was severe enough to cause prolonged droughts. Okay? Prolonged droughts that span for not only years, but decades, perhaps centuries. So what those droughts did is that with less rain, there was less vegetation, with less vegetation meant that the larger animals that people were accustomed to hunt and consume began to die off. Again, so the grasslands and the lush vegetation around the world decreased, so the animals that consumed that vegetation began to die, and they became extinct. So that forced human populations, which were mostly hunters and gatherers up to this time, to develop an alternative survival strategy. And the alternative survival strategy was to start growing their own food. Okay, so climate change is leading to a transformation in the techniques, in the knowledge that human beings are going to use in order to sustain themselves. We talked about that, in the first topic, the food revolution, for example, of the Neolithic era. So this coincided with the Neolithic age as well. Early farming practices. What this entailed is that people are domesticating wild plants. They're bringing in certain cereals or certain vegetables from the wild, and they're learning how to actually grow those vegetables or cereals in small plots or gardens. So this is what's horticulture. This is the precursor to agriculture. Okay, horticulture is gardening, in other words. Early domestication of wild plants to sustain small population, very small populations. In the Americas, the wild plants that were domesticated were corn, beans, and squash. Those will remain the main staples of the Native American diet. Whenever you see horticulturalists or farmers, for example, in the American continent, everywhere and anywhere, we're going to see that they're actually sustaining their communities with corn, beans, and squash. Of course, there will be other vegetables that they're going to domesticate as well. But what's significant here is that the very first early farming practices emerging in the American continent is in Mesoamerica. So Mesoamerica is very significant here because this is going to be the cradle of civilization for the American continent. So, according to studies, the domestication of corn took place. There are two regions that are being tested. One is in south of Mexico, just south of the Central Valley of Mexico. The other region was Guatemala in Central America. Those are the two contested regions where supposedly corn originated. But they're very close to one another anyways. Again, it can be considered as the same region, so to speak, even though they're kind of far apart from one another. But they're very close as well in other senses. So in Mesoamerica, we see people domesticating corn, beans, and squash, and they're also domesticating other wild plants like chili peppers, avocados. It is in South America where we're going to see the domestication of potatoes as well. So potatoes is really something, a vegetable that is, domesticated in South America. But it will become also very significant in the Native American diet, particularly in the South American communities. But for the most part, we see now farming on the rise. And with farming, human beings will no longer need to continue their nomadic lifestyle, their nomadic existence. They don't have to be moving from place to place, chasing the wild game. Now they can settle. Now they have the opportunity to remain in an area because the crops can sustain them. And of course, men will continue to engage in fishing, for example, in hunting and other activities to supply the main diet, to supplement it. But was not necessary to continue moving around. So again, this is leading now to the rise of sedentary communities. And once again, this is occurring first and foremost in Mesoamerica, in Middle America as well. Okay? So they're now living in villages. We see the formation of nested communities, and once again, at the very heart of that community was kinship. You know, people are coming together, they're living together under the premise that they're living together with other relatives and people that are part of their extended family. Okay? So those villages are actually kin groups. So we see the formation of kin groups. Now they're sedentary, they're living together permanently in an area, and they're sustaining their communities through early farming practices. Now, it is at this juncture that we're going to see the very first practice of burials. Burying the dead. Okay? This is going to become a common practice among the sedentary communities. They're burying the dead, and in many cases, they're burying the dead as close as possible to their communities. This is a very unique characteristic of Native American cultures, the close connection that people had with the dead. They're burying them. Now that they live in a village, they start burying them, and they have to bury them very close to their residence. In many cases, they bury their dead inside of their own homes, in their patios, or inside of their own homes altogether. They keep the remains of their dead very, very close as possible, because burying the dead for them meant that, on one hand, they're keeping the remains, the bones of their relatives very close to their place of residence as proof that they are the original inhabitants of that domain. Again, so this is going to become like a sort of property title of sorts. You know, why do you live in this house? Well, because my father lived here, and my grandfather lived here, and all my ancestors have lived here. They were the first ones to arrive here. So this land belongs to us. It's called the principle of first occupancy. Okay, so how do you prove that? Well, they're all buried here. You know, all the first occupiers, in other words, are still buried here. So that's the proof. That's the property title, in other words. So that's on one hand. But on the other, the reason why they're keeping the dead very close to them is because they also believe that the dead continue to exert an influence in the world of the living. They go into this other world, the world of the dead. You know, it's called the underworld. And from the underworld, they continue helping the living members of the family. They provide good health, crops, abundance, you name it, luck in any activity, traveling, you name it, protection of all kinds. So it's important to worship them. And the burial ground where they're buried provides a link to the spirit essence of that ancestor. So very early on, during this period of horticulture, we see the rise of what is called ancestor worship. Burying the dead very closely to them, to claim territories and lands, but also to worship the ancestor for protections and so on in the burial grounds. Again, so burial grounds become actually sacred grounds as well. Now, by 3000 BC, we see the rise of a whole new period in Native American history that is giving rise now to the era of agriculture. Again, so this is consistent with the agricultural revolution that happened in Mesopotamia. We looked at that, for example, the rise of Sumer, the Nile with Egypt, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, for example, in China, and the Indus River with the Indus River Valley Civilization. So it's consistent with this change, the emergence of agriculture, large-scale agriculture. This is no longer just horticulture, but rather this is the mass production of crops. That's what agriculture is. Again, the intensive use of labor, in this case for the massive production of grain. Here, it all starts in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is the home of this agricultural revolution, and we see large-scale corn agriculture on the rise. Again, it's very gradual. This doesn't mean that 3000 BC suddenly there is a massive, production of grain taking place, but the initial steps in that direction begins around this time. There's more people because there's more grain being produced. There's surplus grain, in other words. And with surplus grain, what that means is that people are beginning to live together, to cluster together in large urban areas. So we see the beginning of urbanism, in other words, a gradual beginning of urbanism around 3000 BC. Gradual. Again, this is a very, very slow process of change. By 2000 BC, those urban centers will transform themselves into city-states. By 2000, give and take. That is the beginning of the Olmec period that we're going to get to cover in part 1. We see the rise of city-states. Those are actually, large political entities, or polities as they're called. They're going to be governed by hereditary rulers. In this case, there's a priestly caste or class. There's specializations, there's merchants and artisans and a peasantry. And they have a very well-organized society with an economy, and political systems and rules, etc., trade. In other words, civilizations. Okay? So the agricultural period is really the basis for civilization. I've been repeating this over and over again since the beginning of this course because that's exactly when civilizations began. It began with agriculture. Okay? And the Native Americans were no exception to that. Okay? Now, what's important to note is that as a whole, in the American continent, there will be 3 areas where civilizations flourished before the arrival of Christopher Columbus. Okay? 3 areas of pre-Columbian civilizations. Mesoamerica, of course, was the home of the very first advanced, highly advanced civilizations. There's no denying of that. And that's what the record shows. Middle America. Once again, Middle America constitutes this area of what today is the central part of Mexico. It encompasses also the Yucatan Peninsula and also parts of Central America, particularly the modern-day countries of Belize, Guatemala, for example, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. All of this area together constituted a single cultural region that gave birth to different expressions, so to speak. For example, the very first expression were the Olmecs here in the Gulf of Mexico. They were the forerunners of civilization in the American continent period, and this is again a civilization that flourished in Middle America. The other one was Teotihuacan in what today is Mexico City. Just outside of Mexico City, about 15 miles north of Mexico City, there is an archaeological site, a massive city called Teotihuacan that once upon a time was really the major city-state that controlled all of this area. And more to the southeast, the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America, another expression flourished known as the Mayas. Those were the major civilizations of Mesoamerica. Of course, there were other minor expressions that flourished. We're not going to get to see them. For example, the Totonaca here, in what today is the present-day state of Veracruz. The Zapotecas in what is the state of Oaxaca today, and the Toltecs, the Toltecas as well, just north of Mexico City. We're going to see a cluster of city-states also that belong to another ethnic group called the Toltecs. We're going to get to see very closely here just the Olmecs, the Teotihuacan, and Maya, which were considered really perhaps the most advanced civilizations of the region, but also of the continent. And I should stress also that their intellectual and scientific achievements were so great that they can be compared with the achievements of the other civilizations we have looked in the past, like Egypt, for example, or China, or India. They were highly advanced and very sophisticated, particularly their engineering works, their pyramids, their understanding of astronomy and calendar making. Again, very, very sophisticated and very advanced. In South America, there were also other civilizations that flourished. And they flourished in the western coast of South America. You can see here. One of the most ancient civilizations was the Chavin civilization. It goes back thousands of years into the past. And archaeologists are barely discovering the Chavin civilization, as a matter of fact. Now we have some evidence that most of their cities are still hidden under the Amazon. So this is a civilization that awaits to be explored and discovered. Again, but we know it existed. Again, it's just that we're barely scratching the surface of the archaeological record. The civilization that came later after the Chavin were the Incas. They're more contemporary with the Aztecs that the Spaniards encountered when they arrived to the Americas. And so the Spanish ended up conquering not only the Aztecs, but also the Incas as well in the 1540s. All right. Now, in North America, there was also another highly advanced civilization. We're not going to get to explore, of course, South America or North America, but this is just general information for you to understand and know that Mesoamerica was not the only region that gave birth to city-states and highly advanced societies. There were other areas as well when those developments were taking place. North America was also the home of the Mississippians. They developed their city-states in the eastern part of what today is the United States. Those were agriculturalists. Those were not hunters and gatherers. They were agriculturalists. They grew corn, beans, and squash as well. So obviously, what this tells us is that the knowledge of farming that started out in Mesoamerica was exported out into the rest of the continent through trade networks. Okay? So slowly but surely, the domestication of corn, beans, and squash, those seeds entered other regions, and we see that those seeds, the corn, began to adapt to different climates and environments because North America was a totally different environmental setup or setting than Mesoamerica. This explains the wide variety of corn and beans, for example, and also squash. There's over 100 different varieties of corn in the New World, over 50 varieties of beans, and numerous amounts, of course, of squash as well. And the variation of corn, beans, and squash is due to the climates and the soil, again, from which they adapted. So here in North America, we see also the formation of city-states that were highly populated. Some of them really numbered into 30, 50,000 inhabitants, each one of those cities. They had ceremonial centers. They had a priesthood, rulers, a very highly specialized social system, social classes, system of trade, in commerce and the like, highly civilized. Again, and they built dozens of cities along the Mississippi River, for example. That's why they're called the Mississippians. By the way, Mississippian means mound builder. Again, they were the mound builders. They were shaping earthen mounds in the form of pyramids, and they used them as temples and burial grounds for their rulers. Sorry. All right, so now let's look at Mesoamerica. Mesoamerican civilizations. Before we look at the Olmec, there's another very important area we need to explore, and that is the environment and the geography. By understanding the environment and the geography, we will be able to understand the development of those civilizations, the kind of characteristics they're going to take, for example, the kind of features, the main ideas that were formulated in this region of the world. So we start with the basic understanding that in Mesoamerica there are two very distinct type of environments. Okay? We have the highlands on one hand and also the lowlands. There's a contrast between the highlands and the lowlands. And understanding that contrast is going to enable us to understand the kind of cultural characteristics that emerged in this region as a whole. For example, in the northern highlands, which is again the northern part of Mesoamerica, which is really the central valley of Mexico for the most part, and parts of South Mexico, those are the highlands. This is a more elevated topography. We have volcanoes and mountains, for example. The climate seems to be very beneficial for agriculture. Is very fertile, the soil. It has plenty of rivers as well, plenty of rainfall as well. So again, the environment seems to be very, very in favor of civilization. This is, again, an environment where can easily, human societies, once they organize, they can succeed in creating large urban centers, for example. So this is going to be the home of complex cultures and civilizations, and really this is almost like the norm everywhere around the world. The highlands seem to be the preferred environment for complex cultures and civilizations. Now, what is very significant here about the northern highlands of Mesoamerica is that because of the volcanoes, the volcanic ash that is produced by those eruptions was used by the indigenous peoples to create different kinds of blades and weapons and surgical equipment. This volcanic ash is known as obsidian. So from the obsidian, from this volcanic ash, you can craft blades or flintstones, for example, axes that are very, very sharp. They can be used for warfare or for medicine, to perform surgeries, fine cuts and so on. So this is going to be a highly valued and highly prized commodity by other peoples outside of the highlands, particularly in the lowlands. Consider this as a kind of a military technology. The obsidian is really the raw material to craft military tools. So societies that were conducting warfare or were oriented towards war highly value the obsidian. So the trade connections between the lowlands and the highlands is going to remain constant across thousands of years, because there was something produced in the highlands that was in great demand everywhere. Okay, the obsidian axes and so on. In the lowlands, in the south, in places like, for example, the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala, for example, parts of Central America, We have a more tropical climate. We have a jungle with lush vegetation. This is a harder environment to work. You have to clear the jungle in order to make room and space for urbanization, for example. In many parts of the Yucatan Peninsula, there's no rivers. Again, so this is going to be a more difficult environment, but nonetheless, the Mayas will be able to build their civilizations in the midst of the jungle, and at any rate. But tropical climates also produce tropical products, tropical exotic plants that were also highly valued and highly prized everywhere in Mesoamerica, particularly in the highlands. They can only be grown in the lowlands, like cocoa beans, for example, cocoa to make chocolate, and cotton to make clothing. Those can only be produced in the south. So what that means is that the northern highlands and the southern lowlands are going to build very strong trading connections to the point that their economies are going to be interlocked. They're going to remain in this interdependent trading system. They're going to be trading obsidian, cocoa beans, cotton, and because they depended on each other for those products, those trading connections will remain pretty much in place, permanent, for long periods of time, which allowed, on the other hand, for cultural exchange. When people engage in trade, they're not only trading commercial goods, they're also trading ideas along the trade routes. So this is one of the reasons why Mesoamerica as a whole is going to share a single cultural logic, a single cultural characteristic, a single cultural makeup and complex. Despite the fact that we see different civilizations, very unique, they all share something in common that together they can be studied, they can be assessed or viewed as a single civilization. So the geography, again, is providing for that connection. In what way? In what specific way can we say that they all are part of a single civilization, the Olmec, the Maya, the Teotihuacan, Toltecs, and the like? They all share the same religious worldview or cosmovision. Okay? This is what really brings them together. However different they all share the same view of the cosmos. They have the same religious understanding of how the world works, what is reality, what is sacred, what are the forces that created the world, what is the relationship between human beings and those forces. All of that is being shared in common, particularly because of the trading connections that I just mentioned. For example, there is the idea of nature as sacred. They all share that in common. Nature is sacred. Remember, animism, there are spirits living in nature. But more than that, Native Americans in Mesoamerica believe that nature as a whole is a sacred creation, and the gods that created the world, they live inside of nature. They're not living outside of nature. They're living here. Whether it's the sun god, the moon goddess, the earth goddess, the rain god, the god of the wilderness, and so on. Again, they're all living here. And humans have the responsibility to nourish the gods because the gods nourish humans. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the human world and the world of the gods of nature. So they're nature worshippers. And they believe that because the gods nourish people, we must nourish the gods as well, okay, through ritual. Another idea is the sacredness of corn. Okay? Corn as sacred. This is the only region, the only civilization in the world where a plant becomes a god. Okay? In Mesoamerica, corn is a god, the corn god. As a matter of fact, they believe that when the gods created human beings, they used corn dough, to mold humans. So even humans are made of corn. Okay? And it is the preferred offering of the gods as well. If you're going to offer something to the gods, you have to offer corn. Okay? As well. This is all shared in common across Mesoamerica. The idea that time is sacred. Again, this is a civilization, very unique, that really considers not only time as important, but rather that time is an entity and it's like a god as well. It's sacred. Time is produced by the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the planets as they circle around in the sky, they say. That produces time. But because the sun is sacred, and the moon is sacred, and the planets are sacred, then this phenomenon called time is also sacred. So Mesoamericans are going to be very time conscious. They're going to be charting all of the cycles of time, creating a number of different calendars, and they almost always conducted their activities, whether it's marrying, for example, or conducting war, whether they're planting or harvesting, constructing temples, building a city, or even abandoning a city according to the cycles of time. Okay, so ending cycles, beginning cycles were very important to them, when to do things, in other words. Okay, because time is sacred. The other idea is that they all share in common is ancestor worship. You know, the idea that human beings must remain in contact with the ancestors because the ancestors continue to nourish people in the living world. That's another very, very important, again, idea that is shared in common. The idea of the man god, the idea that there was an individual, an incarnation of God that became human, that lived among people in order to create civilization. He's known as the feather serpent. Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Kukulkan among the Maya, Gucumatz among the Mayas of Guatemala. There's many names. And it's going to be really the central cult that united all of Mesoamerica, the cult of the feather serpent. Okay? Very similar to what Jesus is for Christianity or Buddha for Buddhism, you know, the founder of the religion, the founder of the whole civilization. And last but not least, another very important element of their cosmovision or worldview is the ceremonial city, the idea that the city itself has to be the place of the gods. This is not a place for people to live. Just like in Egypt. In Egypt, people didn't live in cities. The cities were ceremonial centers to carry out rituals, ceremonies, processions, pilgrimages. But only that. Here, the Native Americans share the same value, that the city is to be used for ceremonial purposes. That's why we build cities. This is the home, the abode of the gods. All right, so now the geography also placed significant constraints, you know, in the civilizations that flourished in the American continent, not only in Mesoamerica but everywhere. And that is that, for the most part, Native Americans never really domesticated animals because the animal species that could be used for domestication do not exist in America. For example, in the old world, there's, you know, cattle, horses, sheep, goats, for example. Those animals don't exist in the New World. There was only one animal that was domesticated in South America, the llama, but that was about it. So that placed a constraint on the development of civilizations in the New World. Now, there's no animal domestication, which means that the protein intake is going to be much less, but also that transportation systems are not going to be well developed because there's no animals to be used for transportation purposes as well. The other constraint is iron ore. Iron ore exists in America, but is hidden from sight because it's underground. It has to be mined. Whereas in the Old World, in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, the iron ore can be seen on the surface of the earth. So it was easier for people in the Old World to detect the iron ore, gather it, smelt it, and use it for the creation of steel and iron, for weaponry, for example, or wheels, the creation of the wheel. So Native Americans never really developed any iron tools. They never entered the Iron Age. That's another constraint, that they don't have that advantage, okay, as the Old World civilization. So the geography is really placing the constraint. And the other, of course, is the isolation of the American continent. The American continent is isolated from the rest of the world. So there's no way to receive ideas, technologies, information, or even germs from the Old World, so the Native Americans can develop their own immunity or resistance to the diseases that are emerging in different parts of the world. That's another constraint as well. So despite of those constraints, in Mesoamerica, as well as in North and South America, we're going to see the rise of very great civilizations, despite the fact that they didn't have any animals, they didn't have the wheel or iron tools. They're going to really excel in their architectural, engineering, mathematical, and astronomical knowledge, to the point that they're going to give rise to very, very well advanced civilizations. All right, so now part one is going to look at the pre-classic period of Mesoamerica. Okay, we talked about the Olmec. This is the era of the Olmec, from 1700 to 250 BC. The Olmec. Now, it is very interesting to note that the Olmec arise in a time when other civilizations around the world, particularly the one that we have studied, were flourishing and were perhaps already way, way, way advanced, because most of those civilizations that we looked at started out around 3000 BC. So we can see that the Olmecs are the latecomers, if you will. They're the last ones to arise among the first civilizations of the world. The cradles of civilization, again, were, once again, Sumer in Mesopotamia, Egypt in Northeast Africa, Indus River Valley in India, China, and of course, the Olmec. The first four flourished starting around 3000 BC, the Olmec 1700 BC. So they're the last ones to arise. But keep in mind, the Olmec are considered the cradle of civilization as well in the American continent. Okay? They're the forerunners of civilization. They're considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica. And this is the location where they created their first city-states. Okay? They created four major city-states: San Lorenzo, La Venta, Laguna de los Cerros, and Tres Zapotes. Now, the names I just described are not the original names, of course. Those are names given either by archaeologists or by the villagers that lived in the nearby communities. What were the original names of those sites? We have no idea. And as a matter of fact, even the name Olmec was not the original name by which the peoples that formed those city-states called themselves. The name Olmec comes from the Aztecs. The Aztecs used to call the people that lived during this region as the old men. When the Spaniards arrived to Mexico and confronted the Aztecs provided information about other groups. They said, oh, in this part of the world, the old men live. So the word Olmec in Nahuatl, the Aztec language, means the rubber people, the people of rubber. And that is because the Olmec used to actually fabricate or manufacture a rubber ball to be used for a ball game. And they made it from a substance gathered from the rubber tree that was very abundant in this region and throughout the Yucatan Peninsula, the rubber tree. So they will make a ball and they use it for a ball game. I'm going to explain that again in just a few moments. But that's the reason why they were known as the Olmec, the rubber people. Now, the early rise of the Olmecs, so to speak, go back to the period between 2000 and 1700 BC. Again, the early settlements and the rise of urbanism, again, started out around this time. And it started out around a region along a major river. Once again, we're talking about the river civilizations. We have been talking about the river civilizations, in the past. Civilizations flourish in the river. The Olmec were no exception. In this case, we're talking about the Coatzacoalcos River. Okay, you can see here in this map, this is the Coatzacoalcos River, and they stationed themselves, their farming villages and communities along this river, and they started farming on a large scale. They're also fishing in the river, and they use the river also for transportation purposes as well. Okay, so this allowed for the increase of populations, and as populations increased, we see the rise of urbanism, large urban centers, and those urban centers will become the first ceremonial centers of the Olmec, okay, giving rise to the very first civilizations, the first city-states or ceremonial centers in this case. There were two major ones I want to discuss here, and they started out around 1700 BC all the way to 900 BC. That's the time when they were thriving, in other words. For example, San Lorenzo, the first Olmec capital. And you can see in San Lorenzo a well-advanced and well-formed mathematical understanding of architecture and engineering by the way that the founders of the city built the ceremonial center. There was a lot of city planning here at work. First and foremost, they built their ceremonial center over a man-made earth platform that was over a mile wide. Okay, so they first made a platform. It's a huge, huge platform before they started building their mounds and their temples and their altars in that space. Also, the way they positioned their temples and altars was to orient their temples along a north and south axis. It was symmetrically oriented as well. They built pyramids made from earth formations, or earthen mounds as they're called. Earthen mounds were used as pyramids to conduct their rituals, but most importantly, those earthen mounds were used to bury their dead. Once again, we go back to the burial practices. Rulers, more often than not, were the ones that were buried inside of the earth mounds, and we can see that in those burials. The rulers were buried with very precious stones like jade, granite, and serpentine, for example, which were offerings, to the rulers as they moved into the spirit world. So those were sacred sites, where the rulers were buried in preparation for their entrance into the underworld. The cities also show careful planning in terms of supplying the cities with water. There were aqueducts, for example, and drainage systems. They were also draining the water out of the city as well. So there was, again, highly advanced engineering work being displayed. One of the most interesting, of course, complexes of the cities, of the Olmec cities, was the ball court. I mentioned the ball game. Well, the Olmec were the forerunners of the ball court. It was a religious sport. It was a ceremonial activity. They made a ball from the rubber, again, from the substance, from the tree, the rubber tree. And the players will bounce back and forth the ball by using their hips. That's the only part of their body that could be used to bounce the ball back and forth. And the idea was to get the ball to go into the middle of this ring, as you can see. That's the idea, in order to score a point, in other words. Now, we don't know exactly whether the winning team or the losing team was sacrificed, but either or was sacrificed. I know that among the Maya, later on, we know for sure that the winning team was actually the one being sacrificed to the gods. So that ended up, in the very end of the game with a human sacrifice, which was considered to be an honor to the gods, to sacrifice the best players, for example, and so on to the gods, so the players will go to live among the gods and so on. There was all kinds of ideas associated with this sport. So it is a religious activity. So they're giving rise to the ceremonial ball game that is going to be adopted by the Maya and is going to be adopted by other cultures around Mesoamerica as well. Okay. Now, what those city-states like San Lorenzo also exhibit, for example, is massive, colossal Olmec heads. They weigh 20, 30, 40 tons each, over 6 feet in height, massive. And they depict what appears to be the face of rulers, for example. It is not really very well understood, who they are. This is, again, one of the Olmec heads that is being exhibited in museums, for example. As you can see, there's 17 of them that have been found. Perhaps there are more hidden underneath the earth as well that archaeologists have not yet found. Here's another one. Now, what we do know is that all of those Olmec heads depict what appears to be male figures. They're all male. That's for sure. That's something that is very, very evident from looking at those sculptures. The other characteristic is that they're all wearing headdress, a certain kind of helmet. If you pay attention, you can see a kind of helmet, being worn by this individual. This one as well, there's a kind of helmet. They're all wearing that kind of helmet. So it is not very clear why they're wearing that helmet. Who are they? Are those warriors? Are those rulers? Perhaps ball players. Maybe those were the celebrities, of the ball games. We don't know. Or maybe they're both. They're, rulers, they're ball players, maybe warriors, So we have no idea. Now, the way many of those stone heads have been found, however, indicates that perhaps they serve a religious purpose, that those were kind of totems. A totem is like an object of power, a carving made of rock or stone of a deity, a god, for example, that people attribute magical powers, and people worship that figurine or that statue with the idea that they're worshiping the spirit, the essence that live inside of the stone, because of the way they were positioned. They were positioned in a kind of processional formation. So maybe there was a causeway where people perform a certain procession back and forth, and they will perform rituals and ceremonies devoted to the statues, expecting miracles or expecting magical powers, etc. Again, so that's another possibility, that it could be indeed imbued with some form of magical essences as well. In La Venta, we see for the first time in Mesoamerica the very first pyramid ever built. And this is a stone-based pyramid. It's not an earthen mound. It is really made of rock and stone and so on. Again, it's called the Great Pyramid. Okay, it's a massive, massive structure. And once again, it dates to the pre-classic period, so it's considered to be one of perhaps the oldest pyramids of Mesoamerica. Now, inside of the pyramid, archaeologists have found tombs and burials. Once again, the rulers of those sites were buried inside with jade, the most precious of all stones. And there is now very clearly that the Olmecs were practicing ancestor worship, that the purpose of their altars and their pyramids was, yes, to honor their gods, but also to bury their dead and to keep a close connection with the dead. They were buried inside, so those sites served as links to the outer world. Okay, they served as links to the world of the dead. So the rituals that were performed there were not only offerings to the gods, they were also serving to activate a sacred ground, to maintain a link to the ancestors. Again, which was very, very relevant and very important to the Olmec peoples. Again, the connection to the ancestors. All right, so we have reached the time limit for our class today. This session comes to an end right now. We're going to continue in session 2 looking at Olmec social political organization. We're going to look at the religious worldview of the Olmec. And once we do that, we're going to transition into part 2 by looking at Teotihuacan, the city of the Central Valley of Mexico. And hopefully we get to explore fully part 2, Teotihuacan, and perhaps even move into the Maya world in session 2 when we come back. Okay, so this is all I have for you. I'll see you then in session 2 when we come back. Thank you.